I'm Ellen Herman, co-director of the Wayne Moore Center for Law and Politics and professor of history at the University of Oregon. The mission of the Wayne Moore Center is to promote civic engagement, inclusive democracy, and justice by bringing together students, scholars, activists, policymakers, and members of communities, people just like you. We discuss a wide range of issues affecting Oregon, our nation, and the world. We work in the tradition of Oregon Senator Wayne Morse, who believed that political independence and education were the building blocks of justice and democracy. Today's event is part of the Center's Science, Policy, and the Public theme of inquiry. It will begin with a talk by Professor Sheila Jasinoff titled, "Can Science Make Sense of Life?" followed by brief comments from Professors Francois Bayless and Andrew Nelson. If you aren't already on the Center's mailing list and would like to hear about other events like this one, please sign up for our mailing list on our website. You can type in your email address right at the bottom of the homepage. Thanks to the Knight Campus for accelerating scientific impact for co-sponsoring this event. We are also extremely grateful for the support of the College of Arts and Sciences Lorwin Lectureship on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. Thank you, as always, to the amazing members of the Wayne Moore Center team, Thea Croman, Rebecca Dinwoody-Flynn, Abby Stilley, Dan Titchener, and Christine Waite. They make everything possible. We are indebted also to the many members of the Wayne Moore Circle who are here with us this afternoon. Circle members provide critical support for our programs through annual donations, large and small. Please consider supporting our work by becoming a Wayne Moore Circle member. We are celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, and we look forward to bringing you programs like this one for at least another 20. You are all in for a real treat today, and it is a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker and two commentators. I'll do so briefly so that we have maximum time to hear from them. Sheila Jasinoff is Pforzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the Harvard Kennedy School. She is a pioneer in the field of science and technology studies, often referred to simply as STS, and has published more than 120 articles and chapters and written or edited 15 books. Her work explores the role of science and technology in law, politics, and the policy of modern democracies, touching on subjects ranging from science advisors in government to comparative perspectives on science and technology regulation to the ethics of editing the human genome. She has founded and directs the STS program at Harvard. Before that, she did the same thing at Cornell. She has held distinguished visiting appointments at leading universities in Europe, Asia, Australia, and the United States. Professor Jasanoff served on the American Association for the Advancement of Science Board of Directors and as president of the Society for Social Studies of Science. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She has been the recipient of honors and awards from the Social Science Research Council, the Humboldt Foundation, and the Guggenheim Foundation, among others. Our first commentator will be Andrew Nelson. Professor Nelson is the Randall C. Pape Chair in Entrepreneurship and Innovation and Associate Professor of Management in the University of Oregon Lundquist College of Business. He also serves as the University of Oregon's Associate Vice President for Entrepreneurship and Innovation and as Academic Director of the Lundquist Center for Entrepreneurship. His research explores the development and commercialization of new technologies. He is the author of The Sound of Innovation, Stanford and the Computer Music Revolution, published by MIT Press in 2015, and co-editor of a textbook of technology management theories, now in its 5th edition, titled Technology Ventures from Idea to Enterprise. After Professor Nelson, we will hear from Professor Francois Bayless. Professor Bayless is the 2020-21 Wayne Morse Chair of Law and Politics. She is a bioethicist, philosopher, and university research professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. Her most recent book is Altered Inheritance, CRISPR and the Ethics of Human Genome Editing, published by Harvard University Press in 2019. She currently serves on the World Health Organization's Expert Advisory Committee on developing global standards for governance and oversight of human genome editing. Bayless has published widely on subjects ranging from biomedical research ethics to global reproductive tourism to the COVID-19 pandemic. She is a member of the Order of Canada and the Order of Nova Scotia, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and also of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. In 2017, she was awarded the Canadian Bioethics Society Lifetime Achievement Award. After Professor Jasanoff's talk and the comments from Professor Nelson and Professor Bayless, there will be time for your questions, and we are eager to see what they are. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to chime in with those at any time. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Sheila Jasinoff.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for that generous introduction, but above all for the invitation and for continuing undeterred through the pandemic to bring programming through the Wayne Moore Center. And my thanks also to the team behind the scene who made an event like this possible. And thanks to Andrew Nelson and Francois Bayless for being willing to join us this afternoon. It's an honor to be speaking under the auspices of a center named after a political figure who was revered throughout the country and yet seems now to belong to a different age, when the Senate that he served really used to be called the world's greatest deliberative body. Maybe there's hope that some such restoration may be in the works again. But in the meantime, it's really a pleasure to be able to join you from the other side of the country, thanks to the wonders as well as the challenges of this medium. So thanks for inviting me to speak about my latest book, Can Science Make Sense of Life? I'd like to go ahead and share my screen and situate the book a little bit in the context of where it comes from in my own work and how it stands in relation to the current debates, taking the policy part of your theme seriously, and then go through some episodes from the book that build the kind of argument that this small book seeks to make. So let me herewith go to screen share. All right, so Can Science Make Sense of Life? I mean, there's a little word to say about the title. The title itself was sort of imposed by Policy Press because it appeared in a series where all the book titles have to have some kind of a question mark at their end. I wondered, I mean, since what I wanted to write was not a really simple reflection or speculation, took me a long time to come up with this title, but I'll be interested to hear from the commentators and from others whether I succeeded in matching title to the content of the book itself. So I said I'd situate it a little bit in where books come from, and that's something that I think people don't always have a sense of, but in this case, it represents, the culmination in this. It's not the culmination in the sense that I still hope to be writing other books, but it does mark a particular plateau in a series of reflections that began a long time ago in 1985 with a book called Controlling Chemicals, of which I was a co-author, and that was my first foray into social science research on the theme of science and policy. And one of the things that I learned from that very first comparative research is that deeply held conviction that people have that if you get science right, then all other consequences follow from that, that is just an erroneous assumption. It is not the case that if everybody agrees on the science, then they will also agree on the policy or the politics. And if anything, this is the sort of falsification of that assumption is something that I have spent a lot of my life doing. So fast forward 20 years to another book in which I took on some of the same comparative issues, but in relation to biotechnology and the life sciences in particular. And that book is called Designs on Nature. One of the concepts that I came to in that book is civic epistemologies, a fancy way of saying that people in public life interpret science and technology in different ways. And one can even talk about a political culture as having an epistemology, particular ways in which publics in modern societies, modern political formations, like their evidence and their proof packaged in various ways. And I'll be happy to delve into that in more detail if anybody's interested. But that, to me, marks the next sort of major milestone on the way to this book. A second one is an edited volume called Reframing Rights. And in that collection, I introduced the idea of bioconstitutionalism, making a point that I'll develop shortly in the context of this talk and the book as well, that we have a series of unwritten constitutional assumptions and possibly rights that relate to being living members of a political society. So one often talks about Britain having an unwritten constitution, but in a couple of minutes, I want to say that we in modernity have made an unwritten constitution with science and technology. And if we're going to be democratic societies, in a sense, we need to acknowledge that this unwritten constitution sits side by side with the one that is enshrined in the National Archives. And if there is contestation over the one that's written and whose history we know so well, you can imagine that there's contestation of an equally profound sort over the one that is not written, the one that we have made tacitly with science and technology. And then you can see, can science make sense of life as part of a progression that takes in and tries to elaborate on some of the themes that I've already been developing for a number of years. So I said a moment ago that we have, in effect, a tacit constitution with science and technology, and it takes a particular set of forms when we think about the life sciences and technologies, mainly because one of the major central obligations of a constitutional form of government is to look after life. The state, the government, is responsible for the ways in which we lead our lives. And if we look at 20, 30 years of debates around biotechnology right up to the present day with gene editing and with CRISPR technologies, we see that there has been behind the scenes struggle over who controls the meanings of life and who controls how it should be ordered. Very pragmatically and empirically, we see it in these debates, about all of which one could write reams, and volumes have been written about all of them. Debates around genetically modified crops, around abortion, assisted reproduction. Some of these you have already had programming on, stem cells, the organization and structure of bioethics. So we've heard that Professor Bayless is sitting on a very important bioethics committee, but where does such a committee come from and where does it derive its warrant from? And then, of course, the ubiquitous issues about ownership and rights to own the products of one's own invention, so intellectual property. And one of the things you see under each of these headings is that the struggles have been framed in particular ways. So with regard to assisted reproduction, for instance, I don't think we have time to go over each of these. There has been a lot of contestation on how we should view the woman who, as yet, it is only the woman who bears a child through technologically assisted means. Is that a natural mother, or have we created something of an unnatural kind, a kind of being whose presence in the world we feel funny about. And you see this to some degree in ongoing debates around surrogacy and around reproductive tourism and those kinds of issues. So assisted reproduction is not yet a fully naturalized part of the way we think. And of course, one of the consequences of assisted reproduction has been the production of these test tube babies before they're born. So babies in freezers, embryos in freezers, and what those entities are has become an entire separate domain of conflict and controversy. So in these debates, we see something of this constitutional settlement that we have somehow reached, but not openly reached with science and technology. You see these understandings come into life at specific moments of struggle and controversy. I call them constitutional moments. And the very prominent ones are around, not surprisingly, the definition and boundary of the human. And where does human life begin and end? What is a living entity after all? These are not just philosophical questions. Philosophers have worried about these issues for eons in multiple different philosophical and religious traditions. But today around science and technology, you see some of the same kinds of debates playing out. As a result, STS scholars, including myself, say that these debates perform a kind of ontological surgery that is separating one kind of entity or being from another. For instance, what is an embryo that is made through IVF? In this country, in the US, there is a division, a political division, as to whether that embryo is a matter of serious concern and should be treated as a full-fledged human being, or is something different and maybe should be respected, but not in the same way that we respect human beings. So we're not settled in this country on the answer to what is an embryo made through IVF. This is one of these moments that we've been embroiled in for many years already. How we settle these questions has a lot of implications for things that we normally leave to the Constitution. Is it a right? Is it not a right? Does it involve dignity? Does it not? Is it property instead of being something that is a being entitled to respect for itself? So these constitutional moments are incredibly important. And we find as we go across countries and political cultures that this unwritten constitution that governments have with science and technology, that not just governments, but the people who are governed have with science and technology, that those constitutions differ. So in this country, in the US, we have this vision of science and politics being strictly demarcated from one another, separate. The domain of truth and the domain of politics are not supposed to mix. And if you think back over the last 4 turbulent years, you will remember that one of the main sites of struggle was over this question of truth. And the left and right divided as to whose truth counted as truth, and whether you could have things like alt facts and so on. So all of that language, the alternative fact, this was very American, and it points to a particular set of commitments that we have in this country that are very deeply rooted in our political culture. And along with that, as is well known, we also have a very individual-centered way of thinking about what people are entitled to and what they should be doing. We live in a constitution that sets up a rights-oriented way of thinking about what is due to individuals. If you comparatively look at the UK and Germany, you find 2 quite different settlements. And often, it's often said that fish don't know they're in water. So similarly, people living inside a political system often don't know what their political system actually consists of and what its unwritten assumptions are. I like doing comparative work, partly because it shows to me that there are other different settlements possible based on other kinds of assumptions. So in the UK, of course, scientific knowledge matters, but common sense agreements that facts and concerns go hand in hand and we should respect them together, that is a fairly deep-rooted, deep-going part of the British political culture. And the family and the society are of major concern just as much as the individual. I sometimes think, though this is the kind of proposition that can't actually be proved, that Britain's royal family, in a sense, articulates this sort of symbolic role of the family. It's as if there's a genealogy connecting everybody to this family. And, so it's a matter of news when Prince Philip, at the age of 99, goes into the hospital, because it relates to the genealogy of the entire family of the UK. And for us, that's simply not something that's in play in that sense. And then if you go to Germany, you find that the baseline is very dependent on law. So in a lot of places where the UK goes by political consensus, Germany says you need law. And I'd be happy to talk about some of these things if anyone's interested with more specificity, but let's just leave it at that for now. And in Germany, there's a strong sense of social solidarity. The work I've been doing recently, that is unrelated to today's talk, but it's a multi-country comparison of national responses to the COVID crisis. And we find that in Germany, a kind of social solidarity has been very prominent in allowing them to enact policies that are painful to parts of society, and nobody has fought back. Certainly nobody has talked about kidnapping Angela Merkel or laying siege to the Bundestag with guns in the way that we've experienced in some states of the United States. Right, so there are all those settlements in the backdrop, and then along come moments that make everybody sit up and take notice. And one such moment of disruption concerned the announcement back in 2018 by this young man, He Jiankui, who announced to everybody's surprise and astonishment at a major meeting on human genome editing that he had gone ahead and used CRISPR technologies to modify the genes of two Chinese baby girl twins without any kind of sanction that the world at large recognized as adequate. And very soon, the newspaper headlines started noting this point. So implications of experimenting with genetically edited babies, the scientist himself being put on the defensive, an immediate othering. So if you are interested in humanistic studies and think about Orientalism at all, you will see that here China is being made the place where, not surprisingly, it's the brave new world of editing human DNA. It couldn't happen here. The scientist then begins to face consequences and ultimately gets sentenced to 3 years in prison. But which is a tragedy for him in human terms. But this central thing, why China is the brave new world of editing human DNA, it turns out that it doesn't really stand up so neatly and cleanly if one is thinking about the sort of global political economy of science and technology. It turns out that some US researchers had been consulted by He Jiankui, and he himself felt, rightly or wrongly, that he had received encouragement from a number of his US scientific colleagues. And some of us, including Dr. Bayless, know about a meeting that he was at in the US in 2017, at which he felt that he had received tacit encouragement from the other scientists in the room to go ahead and try his path-breaking experiment. So if China is the brave new world, possibly we have created a place where somebody else can break the rules so that we can then retreat to a kind of holier than thou position. There's no question that Chinese genetic editing, gene editing, and genetic engineering were in close conversation with the American world throughout this period. So those kinds of political developments and developments in the worlds of science and research policy and ethics lie behind the questions that I pose in this book. What is life? What is it for? What are the purposes of it? And I am a lawyer by training, and I sit in a policy school. So this question, who holds the answers, is of enormous significance to me. So one can start the story arbitrarily far back, but one place to start it is the mapping and sequencing of the human genome. And, I like these historical record pictures because they tell us a lot about the interpenetration of science and politics. So when the mapping and sequencing, the first draft sequence was announced, it was announced by none other than the President of the United States. And behind him, you see the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, because Britain wanted very much to be seen as a partner, a transatlantic partner, part of this close alliance with the American project. And Science magazine had this image of the human genome. There are a couple of things to note about the image. So one is of course, the attention to American pluralism and the attempt to say through a picture that this is for all of humanity. So we have people of different races, people of different ages as you go up the tree of life, kind of depiction of what is at stake. You see people going from infancy to age. Something that I hadn't So what this brought to mind for me was movie posters of the ways in which actors are often depicted. Like, if you go back and look at old Star Wars movie posters, you will see similar sorts of arrangements. Something I hadn't noticed the first time around was how it's also emblematic of DNA. I mean, so the ways in which the figures are intertwined is as if the human and the DNA are being made identical in some sense. But the other thing you notice, at least if you're looking at American depictions, is the beauty of all of these faces. I mean, so lurking behind the background of this decoding of the human genome is a sense of perfectibility. And that sense of perfectibility has been one of the selling points of what we're trying to accomplish with the technologies that are derived from our understanding, not just of the genetic code, but the way in which the genetic code is structured and organized to make human life itself a possibility. Another sort of historical fact that warrants mentioning in this context is the language that Bill Clinton himself used. So he is the political leader of the country that is claiming credit for having brought about this miraculous discovery. And his language is full of religious allusions. Today, we're learning the language in which God created life. And I'll come back to this point about language, but with it, what do we do? So not just that God created life, but we are gaining the power, immense power to heal. So immediately this question of perfectibility comes into play. Healing suggests that there are lots of things around that may be defective, that are diseased. And with this, armed with this knowledge, we are now in a position to heal. So immediately, the mapping and sequencing of the human genome becomes part of the arsenal of biomedical technologies. I mean, that's the way it's understood immediately. And it is now imaginable, according to Bill Clinton, it's conceivable that our children's children will know the term cancer only as a constellation of stars, so the galaxy cancer, and not the disease. So if you've delved in science policy for a long time, you will know that the war on cancer was declared by the national government under President Nixon in 1972. We still speak of a war on cancer. It's an ongoing battle, but nevertheless, it remains there as a promise. So the technology is there. What is life for becomes, in this set of observations, something that is always on the verge of being perfected, and being perfected how? Through our knowledge of science and through its applications to technology. So even in this political speech, no doubt crafted by one of his talented writers, the President of the United States is adopting a position vis-a-vis this constitutional status of the life sciences. He's telling us what life is and what it is for in the context of this very announcement. That way of thinking, in turn, ties up, is very comfortably aligned with science's own notion that it is a sovereign power. And one thing that I talk about in the book is how the life sciences come to declare themselves as sovereign. And with that idea of sovereignty, there are some propositions that I would like to note specifically. So sovereignty implies a degree of autonomy and independence, and science in this country has always claimed that kind of autonomy. It is a governing force. So when science brings forth new things, science can also govern that novelty, is responsible for governing its own new creations, so long as there aren't undue risks to health, safety, or the environment. And that implies that downstream effects that are not up close to the centers of invention, are supposed to more or less take care of themselves. Scientists often think that they put new things into the world. There is an initial period of fear, and all we need is time. During that time, a process of naturalization occurs. So when I said before, are IVF mothers natural mothers or unnatural mothers? This is an example that the life scientists often point to. They say that when the two scientists, Edwards and Steptoe in Britain, produced the first test tube baby in 1978, that this was a moment when people said that this is unnatural, it shouldn't happen. And today, look, there are millions and millions of babies born through IVF. We have come to accept it as the new normal. If you would just leave science on its own to go ahead in the ways it wants to go ahead, then in time, people will overcome their fear, and reason and progress will prevail. So this is not just a set of promises, which it is, but it is also a claim to sovereignty. It's a claim to autonomy, because you don't really have to regulate what science does at the bench, because eventually people will come around and accept that science was only in this for the human good, and therefore we've come to accept that our ideas of the good are rightfully aligned with the purposes and objectives of science. So it came as no surprise to anybody that when the CRISPR technique was unveiled, sooner or later, scientists would take the lead on how to govern CRISPR. And the first sort of step in this was in 2015, when the US National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, together with Britain's Royal Society and the Chinese Academy of Sciences, decided to hold what they called a summit, an international summit. Now, I invite any of you who are interested to go back and look at who the committee was that organized it, and maybe Professor Bayless will say a word about this. But in any case, international left, shall we say, a huge series of gaps. It wasn't international, it was the international leaders of science and technology in this field who had got together to initiate a global discussion, but it had this political ring to it because it was a summit. So it was a peak or pinnacle meeting at which science was going to do something declaratory. It was going to discover or announce what the right norms should be for human gene editing. 3 years later, in November of 2018, a second summit was organized and carried out. And in that second summit, in effect, the scientists who authored a report said that now we are at a point where we can chart a pathway to translating the fundamental basic science knowledge we have on gene editing into clinical applications. They did say that we would need standards, that is in the first paragraph of the proposed translational pathway. They said that we should have independent assessments, and they referred to this extremely disturbing story by He Jiankui as an unexpected and deeply disturbing claim. But the claim itself was in a way turned around on its head. It did not signal to the participant scientists that maybe something was wrong in the sort of ethical stance of the world. They drew it into the idea that we need more regulation. And in that third paragraph, you see speed the development of regulatory science. Now, I have a particular stake in this term regulatory science because I think I was one of the first people who coined the term back in a 1990 book on scientific advice to government. Speeding the development of regulatory science is in a way putting the shoe on the wrong foot. Regulatory science, when such a thing came into being, was there serving the purposes of public policy. I mean, there were areas where people wanted to get things done. They recognized they needed science. And so regulatory science came into being as the kind of knowledge that bridges the gap between what we do know and what we want to get done. Here, however, regulatory science becomes the passport by which CRISPR technologies can move from the lab bench into clinical application. And here are these eminent scientists wishing to speed up the development of regulatory science, which will necessarily speed up the capacity of scientists to do more or less what they wish in terms of their research agendas. So in the book, Can Science Make Sense of Life? I talk about the different steps by which we get to the point of symmetry and its declaration of autonomy. And I talk about eureka moments being moments of discovery in science and technology where context disappears and it becomes simply a mental activity of enormous brilliance. And I go in detail into talking about the constitutional role of science in the same ways that I've talked about it, and ontological politics, the politics of drawing boundaries between one kind of entity and another kind of entity in different ways. And I'll talk about that a little more in a moment, because it often plays itself out through language games. What do we actually want to call something, and who is thereby entitled to play a part in the deliberations that accompany the creation of new things? Through all of these steps, we see a concept of biopower, power to declare the meaning and the purposes of life, the very essence of life. And that in turn follows from a long history in which the sciences have tried to lay claim to the basic questions: what is life for, and who decides? It began to some extent as a physicist's dream. This is Erwin Schrödinger, who wrote a very famous, well, he delivered a famous set of lectures that then became codified as a little book, What is Life? And it served as an inspiration to people like Watson and Crick, who in their subsequent work discovered the structure of DNA. But in Schrödinger's book, he already talks about a code, the genetic code. I mean, it wasn't known by that name, but he observes that there must be some kind of directive force inside the chromosomes that tell us the different kinds of physical forms that life can take. And so the closest he comes to talking about the language of DNA, talking in the language of DNA, is that he says that these chromosomes contain some kind of code script, in some kind of code script, the entire pattern of the individual's future. So that is very much a physicist's vision. You just get inside the nucleus of whatever the thing is, and you will find the secret forces that hold all of us together. So the entire pattern of the individual's future is in this code script, and that has led to an enormous amount of both moral and technical reductionism. So I prefer to come at it from another side. And one of my favorite paintings in Boston's very well-known Museum of Fine Arts is this extraordinary painting by Paul Gauguin that he made in 1897 in Tahiti. And he or called it in French, where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? It's interesting that he did not put a question mark at the end. And it's a work of beauty and symbolism. But more than that, to me, it's a work that shows that you can pose these essential questions about what life is, coming from very different points of view. And it's been quite persuasively argued that these are questions from the Catholic Catechism, and that when Gauguin was reflecting on them, he was reflecting his own early training in the Catholic faith. But we fast forward to 1953, and an Englishman and an American, James Watson and Francis Crick, give a different meaning to what life is, where we come from, and where we're going. And for them, it's in this structure of the double helix. You can see it in the Science Museum in London. The original model is there. And of course, it was a moment of brilliant discovery. But that discovery goes hand in hand with some other sorts of things as well. One of them is that there is money lying behind it. And this is one of the more notorious figures in the history and development of the life sciences and technologies. He's the inventor of the famous technique of PCR, with which you can magnify even tiny quantities of DNA, and it's the basis for many things that today happen in the life sciences and technologies. And he got a Nobel Prize for this, but he's quite well known as one of the more controversial Nobel laureates ever, and spent most of his time, preferred to spend much of his time with his surfboard. And he wrote an autobiographical work called Dancing Naked in the Mind Field, and that's its Italian translation, but I depict it in Italian because it, sort of images the man and his vision, I think, in a more articulate way than any other book covers I've seen. But side by side with that, there's a different story of making PCR that comes out of the anthropological tradition, Making PCR by Paul Rabineau. And there is a historian of science, a colleague of mine, Stephen Shapin, who has written amusingly about the difference between the pure, basic dancing in the mind field kind of metaphor and the actual life and discovery history of Kary Mullis. So in his memoir, he writes, at mile marker 46.58 on Highway 128, and Shapin ironically observes he had both the presence of mind and the sense of history to note the exact spot, if not the month, that the epiphany arrives. And Shapin points to this eureka moment point, that the heroic and crusty individual breaks with hoary cultural convention. And there are many other historical tales: Archimedes alone in the bath, Newton alone in the garden with the apple tree, and Kekule alone with his dreams that gave him the structure of the benzene circle. And yet, why should the entrepreneurial scientist not also be human? And Shapin points out the many incentives for the new style scientist to be human. And to be human means to engage in, among other things, mercenary traits as well. So by erasing all of this infrastructure, the political economy that makes science possible, science at once gains autonomy, but sheds itself of any sort of bias or self-interest. And this is a first step towards gaining the kind of authority that science commands in our lives. At the same time, the ambitions and the promises have grown ever larger. So this is the first article on CRISPR in MIT's Technology Review. And two things strike me about this. One, the grandiosity of the promise. We can now engineer the human race. I mean, we have engineered the human race in all kinds of ways already, but never mind that. But the second thing is, why did they pick this picture? And again, all moral philosophers will be well aware of this, that one of the ways in which the paradoxes of power, what should we do with this technology, is often phrased is, should parents have the right to pick blue-eyed children? Now, what I wonder as an STS scholar is, why has that become the canonical example? So much so that when MIT chooses to illustrate the birth of this new technology, for which now a Nobel Prize has been awarded, it's the blue-eyed child that becomes emblematic. I mean, so what is the humanity that we're trying to re-engineer? So another step in this progression towards taking on the authority, both to declare what life is and what life's purposes are for, is an ongoing struggle over the right language to use. And in the book, I discuss some of these episodes. One of them concerns the Clinton Commission on bioethics. And that commission particularly openly talked about the terminology that should be used in talking about bioethics. So we have sought terminology that most accurately conveys the descriptive reality of the matter. So bringing the language as close as possible to the reality of the matter. And in this little passage, we have resisted the temptation to solve the moral question by artful redefinition, or by denying some morally crucial element a name that makes clear that there is a moral question to be faced. So STS scholars will recognize that there is so-called boundary work going on here, that first you declare the facts, which are the reality and on the merits, and then the moral arguments come because you've clarified and purified this language in some way. And particular things that moves that this commission recommended were that you get rid of reproductive cloning and replace it with cloning to produce children. You get rid of therapeutic cloning and use cloning for biomedical research. And you see there political moves that people adopt in other contexts as well. So one of them is plain language, and hence anti-intellectualism. Philosophers left to their own devices, the implication is we'll concoct terms that are too abstruse, so let's get down to basics. Let's not talk about rights and responsibilities. Let's break the connection to constitutionalism. Let's give our own definition to ideas like parents and children, and let's keep on drawing the boundary between research and therapy. So in the previous slide, you will note that they wanted to say cloning for biomedical research, thereby redrawing a line between basic science and its applications. So is this successful? I was myself present at a rather amusing meeting that is in the public record, and hence I can talk about it, where scientists who were creating synthetic human embryo-like creatures in glass dishes started talking about their inventions, and they used an abbreviation, Sheila, S-H-E-L-E, and one observer at the scene noted that this name was pronounced the same way as the name Sheila, and it drew, she said, the reporter said, astonished responses from the Harvard audience, with participants noting the incongruity of giving a familiar woman's name. Well, the participants in question were me, because it's my name as it happens, and I did point out the incongruity of using a common gendered name for this purpose. I believe that in Irish English, it actually stands for woman to some degree. Anyway, and this woman reporter noted the one-sided perspective of the all-male panel. This was one of these events that actually made the manel into a term of art and critiquing science policy. So it didn't go unnoticed. And just last year, somebody congratulated me and said, "You are the only person I know who has made your colleague George Church change his mind about something." I said, "Oh, really? I no respect and am on endless things with George Church. I didn't think I'd ever changed his mind." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, you got him to change from Sheila to Sheaf and talking about these embryos." So, well, if that's what it takes. But it shows how unthinking this right to name and claim ownership over is through an episode of this sort. And within a brief period. Here is a report in the New York Times from March 2017. In the report, Jean Diach and his colleagues explored the ethics of creating what they call synthetic human entities with embryo-like features. So sheaths now become the term of art, and all of that other history of what was going on with the naming just disappears into the background, and you take the scientific name as the name, and this now stands for the truth. So I want to make a quick detour now and finish with a little bit more, not exactly speculative, but reflections from another point of view. And I want to take us through a short story, a work of literature that to some degree points up and out, I think, the moral dilemmas that these advances in the sciences and technologies put before us. And this is a rendition of Borges' famous story, Library of Babel, and it was written in 1941. And here are a couple of passages from the book. Borges' story preceded by a dozen years the decoding of the structure of DNA, and yet his description of the library and of the actors scurrying around inside bears uncanny resemblances to biologists' search for the control of life in the genomic age. There is, first of all, the library's sheer immensity. Its halls are endless, rendered even more so with reflective mirrors, just as the human genome encodes infinitely many future lives, so the library allows for the generation of all possible works of language. Yet its physical capaciousness is created, as in the human genome, through a series of infinitely interlocking structures. You might call them tandem repeats if you want the language of biology, built out of a parsimonious vocabulary of shapes and a limited repertoire of letters. Then there's the architecture of the whole, held together by a spiral stairway. So this is 1941 note, which sinks abysmally and soars upwards to remote distances. That's a quote from Borges. That spiraling structure branching into the rooms of the library seems as if inspired in a premonitory dream by the as yet undiscovered double helix of DNA's sugar phosphate backbone, holding the eternally paired and bonded bases, adenine to thymine and cytosine to guanine. But what emerges from that is that description is, on the one hand, the desire for control, and on the other, the futility of some of the searches for meaning inside of this structure of Babel. And so I want to read to you now just the concluding paragraphs of the book to give you a sense of where I am coming from. So science exerts power in part by turning the myriad pathways for living that humankind has evolved over millennia into singular channels that have undeniable value for segments of the human community, such as eliminating inherited disease or producing more biofuels. But these solutions, quote unquote, may not speak to the fundamentals of the human condition, and they may err or produce unintended consequences through premature simplification. Seduced by science's power to know and name its inventions, we're in danger of forgetting that the reaches of the human mind extend far beyond the electron microscope and the Lego bricks of synthetic biology. Even Borges' Library of Babel held only works composed in the 26 letters of the Roman alphabet, raised in a language written in a different syllabary, but with a musicality of its own that rivals any other. I think of the meditations on life learned in even the most secular Bengali families of the 20th century, where the materiality of life was treated as almost incidental to the spirit that animates living. I think in particular of Aguner Parushmoni, the 1905 song by Rabindranath Tagore that accompanied, and perhaps still does, most memorial services at the passing of family or friends, with its opening stanza, "Purify my life with the purging touch of fire, purify my life with your blessings of searing pain. Make it pure like the gold that passes the test of fire." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jasanoff. I believe this is the moment where I insert some comments. And I'd like to begin with a note of gratitude. My first degree is actually in science and technology studies, and this is a field that Professor Jasanoff has done so much to define and to grow, and her insights have long influenced my own thinking. So this is truly an honor. Let me begin by noting that this is quite obviously a time in which science is getting a lot of attention. We're in the midst of a global pandemic. We're turning to epidemiologists to understand the spread of COVID-19. We're turning to physicians to understand treatment. We've witnessed the creation of multiple vaccines with incredible effectiveness rates and in record time. And at the same time, many of the developments of the past year, including not only COVID, but also renewed concern over racial justice and turmoil around US democracy, have led to a social reflection on human values, ethics, and life itself. So needless to say, Professor Jasanoff's book is quite a timely contribution. Now, one challenge, of course, of preparing remarks before hearing Professor Jasanoff's talk is that I based them more on her book, where some themes such as money and commercial influence are more emphasized, and to be transparent, perhaps more aligned with my faculty role in a business school. And I also should say at the outset that Professor Jasanoff and I agree on many things that appear in this book. Items like price gouging by pharmaceutical companies, which obviously is bad. That in democracies, people have a voice, and that voice is not, or rather should not be, dependent on one's financial position. And perhaps most fundamentally, that science at its heart is a messy and social process, not an account of lone individuals and their eureka moments. But I've also realized this would be a rather boring commentary if all I did is to repeat Professor Jasanoff's claims, and in a less eloquent fashion at that. So I'm going to attempt here to be a bit more provocative in my remarks, and I'm going to focus explicitly on three questions in response to Professor Jasanoff's book. Is this new? Is this biology? And is this, in fact, the price of expertise? So to begin, is this new? In her book, Professor Jasanoff paints a compelling view of science moving literally from fields and greenhouses into academic and commercial labs, from high-minded attempts to understand truth to commercially oriented pursuits motivated by money, and from language and practices widely accessible to those controlled and understood by only a small number of people. In fact, she writes while documenting the start of the biotechnology revolution, quote, "Pure science, the quest for truth and order for their own sakes, was a thing of the past." And it's funny that, that Professor Jasanoff mentions the work of Steve Shapin, a science historian whom I greatly admire and she knows very well, because it was a book of his that got me thinking about this argument. That book has perhaps the longest title of any academic book, and it's called Never Pure: Historical Studies of Science as if it were produced by people with bodies situated in time, space, culture, and society, and struggling for credibility and authority. Shapin's point, as his book title implies, is that science was never, quote, pure. And I wonder, therefore, the extent to which we might overclaim some of the phenomenon that Professor Jasanoff is describing as new or newly problematic. For example, the economic historian Brian Wright notes that science originally operated under a patronage system, a tool for the very wealthy to explore questions of personal interest, which is hardly a democratic ideal. Or more recently, industrial research labs, such as those of General Electric, DuPont, and Kodak, were the major scientific forces in early 20th century United States, showing that commercial funding and organization of the scientific enterprise is nothing new. Work done at AT&T's Bell Labs, which itself is the product of a monopoly, went on to produce 9 Nobel Prize winners, more than most any US university, showing that commercial interests need not be at odds with inquiry-focused science. Now, to be sure, some things have changed, and perhaps rather dramatically. For example, industry funding of university science has gone up substantially in recent decades, though I think it's also important to note that it's still dwarfed by government funding, which still accounts for almost 95% of university-sponsored research. The ability to manipulate the basic building blocks of life also is new, but the power to destroy life on an unprecedented scale through atomic weapons is now 75 years old. So where I'm driving with these questions is a fundamental question of whether what we're witnessing has to do more with changes in scale or magnitude or changes in character. And that's a question I would love to see Professor Jasanoff explore further. It also brings me to my second point of, is this biology? And I mean this in two ways. First, is this all biologists? And second, is this only biology? So the first question of who exactly is bringing about these changes can be a little bit tricky to parse. I'm going to selectively quote from Professor Jasanoff's book here. It explores how biology positioned itself as the prime custodian of the meaning and purpose of human life. Quote, biology and biotechnology have continually proclaimed themselves as humanity's most compelling instruments for making sense of life. Quote, biological research continued to propagate a myth of autonomy and capacity for self-governance. Quote, science instrumentalized life by profiting from its manipulation. And I should note that there is good evidence presented to back up each of those. But the challenge here is that biology itself is, of course, a categorization that we have invented. It is not something which acts on its own. Positioning, proclaiming, profiting, propagating, these all require people. And the question, therefore, is who or through whom within biology and science did all of these things. Now, to be fair, of course, Professor Jasanoff gets into specific names, David Reich, James Watson, Kary Mullis, and so on. But the question here is whether these examples of the most elite and, to be fair, perhaps the most outrageous scientists are the exception or the rule. And what I would have loved to see more of in the book would be an account of the thousands, indeed millions, of everyday practitioners of science, many of whom would probably agree that science alone cannot provide answers to the meaning of life. One thing I've noticed in my own work, interviewing, observing hundreds of scientists in different fields, is that even labels like biologist and scientist can, of course, be problematic. Biologists practiced in settings ranging from community colleges to elite universities, from the US Forest Service to startups like Moderna, and focusing on projects ranging from designer babies, as Francois Bayless discussed last week, to the continued cataloging of flora and fauna. In short, there's so much diversity of motivation, focus, activity, resources, and values within these labels that I think we need to be careful when ascribing attitudes or behaviors to the field as a whole. And this brings me to my second point of whether this is only biology. The book, of course, is titled, Can Science Make Sense of Life? Though I think the real focus here is molecular biology and biochemistry. But I couldn't help but wonder about some other disciplines. For example, right now we see very similar debates taking place in nanotechnology and even in areas like computer science. For example, the question of whether a driverless car faced with an imminent collision with a pedestrian on a cliffside road should protect the driver's life or the pedestrian's is quite literally a question of life, and it implicates both scientific expertise and the commercial powers that fund this research. What would be interesting, I think, is to compare how various subdisciplines of science have approached questions of life and to understand whether the story of biochemistry and biotechnology is playing out elsewhere. If so, or if not, then why? And my third and final point asks whether some of what Professor Jasanoff describes is in fact the price of expertise. So in her book, she describes how the place for discovery of early biology was, quote, the island, the countryside, and the botanical garden, but it later became the research laboratory. In an earlier paradigm, a layperson could fully participate in science. Later, however, scientists used specialized instruments and increasingly specialized language not accessible to the general public. Now, in some ways, of course, what Professor Jasanoff is describing here is what sociologists identify as the process of professionalization. In short, a craft develops more refined and specific language and practices, along with certification and educational requirements that are explicitly intended to keep members of the general public out. And one need not look at scientists to observe this process. One could observe lawyers, engineers, librarians, police officers, and even professors like myself doing the same thing. Increased professionalization comes at a cost, almost by definition, of excluding others. But the failure to recognize the expertise that professions develop also comes at a cost. I couldn't help when preparing these remarks to reflect back on another Wayne Morse speaker, Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who joined the Wayne Morse series last month and highlighted some of the problems we encounter when the voice of scientific experts is considered no more valid than that of lay people who don't share that expertise. In fact, as I was reading Professor Jasanoff's book, I encountered news from my own hometown in rural Montana that the county commissioners were replacing medical expertise on the health board with people who believe that COVID-19 is a hoax. And the reasoning given, as stated by one commissioner, was, quote, I think we need diversity on that board. I don't want a bunch of doctors. My point here is that even as we acknowledge that the expertise claimed by scientists may in fact exclude broad swaths of the general public, we also need to acknowledge that this same expertise may be based on knowledge that is in fact more valid than that of some members of the general public. So the ultimate question here then is, what are we to do? And here, of course, I suspect that Professor Jasanoff and I are in full agreement. If science is a social process and science has social implications, then decisions around science must be answered through a social system, and I would argue a democratic one. And Professor Jasanoff, of course, has written a great deal about this. To me, that starts with better conversations. One of the most important initiatives of UO's Night Campus for Accelerating Scientific Impact consists of science communication training, in which all faculty and graduate students participate. The idea here is to ensure that scientists can speak not only with their peers, but also with legislators, the media, and members of the general public. And this is important because conversation, communication, and considered debate lie at the very heart of the democratic process. And that, for me, is perhaps the most resounding takeaway from Professor Jasanoff's book. That is, at the end of the day, the book may have less to do with biology and more to do with democracy. For although the book is titled, "Can Science Make Sense of Life?" I think in some ways that's a trick question, since science neither can nor should attempt to address that question alone. Instead, I think the real question might be, can democracy make sense of life? And for all our sakes, I certainly hope that answer is yes. Thank you very much.
Well, hello, everyone. I have to say, it is always a pleasure to listen to Sheila. It's always a wonderful opportunity for me to learn, but I so enjoy the rich sources she draws upon in art and literature and so on. It's never a dry conversation. I've also had the pleasure of reading her book and preparing for today, and it is an engaging read. I'm actually not going to intersect with the book, however, except insofar as it intersects with her talk, because what I want to do is I want to engage with 3 or 4 of the claims in her talk that intersect with my work. So the first claim I want to address is, I'm paraphrasing, but I think it's pretty close to right. Sheila made the comment that there is this belief that if you get the science right, everything else will fall into place. It'll be easy. We'll know what to do. We'll know how to govern. We'll know how to, if you will, maximize the benefit. This clearly is a very strong assumption in the world and the way in which it works. It is a perspective that is sufficiently pervasive that what it has is a lot of conversations focusing on the idea that the current problem we have is science literacy, that the science has become so complicated, the public can't understand it, and therefore they don't have a place at the table. So what's interesting is it does have something to do with the few comments you've just heard here with respect to expertise. And the idea is that the public doesn't have any expertise, and therefore they don't have a seat at the table in terms of directing, governing, managing, if you will, the science. I certainly see that often in some of my work, where I literally hear the equivalent of, if they only understood the science, they would agree. So there's this confidence that the public is smart in some sense, because if they could, a conditional statement, if they could understand the science, they would agree with us. What happens then as a consequence of this belief is you have these sort of grand commitments to public education, all based on the knowledge deficit model, that's the purpose of public education. It's to help people to understand so that they can then agree. And I think Sheila would agree with me that that's deeply problematic for all kinds of obvious reasons. So where my work is concerned, part of what I've tried to do is I've tried to say, well, if you want to talk about science literacy, I get to talk about ethics literacy. What do you know about that? And one of the things that's interesting there is this belief, well, we all have ethics because, I learned it on my mother's knee. And I don't want to say that that's not very important learning. I think that's absolutely key. But I think it's a way also then of dismissing content that can come from society in terms of social knowledge, cultural knowledge, ethical knowledge, spiritual knowledge, etc. And I think that one of the things we need to talk about is a broader understanding of what constitutes knowledge. So in my own work, I've been trying to talk about public education, engagement, and empowerment. And what I do is I somewhat erroneously, narrowly describe public education as predominantly a one-way street from experts to the public. The public is the receiving of what its role is to receive wisdom. That secondly, with engagement, you at least have some understanding that there are different ways of knowing in the world and different kinds of knowledge that requires recognition. And so engagement would at least be sort of bi-directional. We both have something to contribute to the conversation. But to me, what's most interesting is this idea of empowerment, because then that's actually a sharing of the power in a meaningful way. So I don't think engagement is enough. And what we are starting to see in some of the literature and in some policy circles is a willingness to move from education to engagement. We haven't seen very much that would also take the next step towards empowerment. The second comment I want to make is with respect to the importance of language and the power to name. And this is explored more fully in the book, but you did get a taste of some of the ideas in today's talk. And one of the things that I find particularly interesting is the way in which naming is very often about eliding the ethical issues and setting aside the debate, and therefore, again, making it clear that, if we can just get the terms right, it'll be so obvious what the ethical answer is. And in my career, I've had a number of debates over time on a couple of key terms, and I want to share those with you because I've lost on every single one of those debates, so the terms will be very familiar to you. In the late 1980s, I argued against the language of gene therapy. And I said it ought to be called gene transfer because we had no therapies to offer, and that in fact it was going to be deeply problematic to be going out and asking people to participate in research, have them understand that they were participating in knowledge production when what we asked them to consent to was gene therapy. I was the academic secretary to a national report on this topic for what was then our Medical Research Council, and I lost. The whole report is about gene therapy, and I guarantee if you go back and look at history, there were no therapies on offer at that time. Another debate I have not done well in is around the issue of surrogacy. I've argued for that to be called contract pregnancy, even in a context where it may not be a commercial contract. It could be an altruistic contract, but it is in fact making it claim that the woman is not a surrogate. She is doing the work of being pregnant in some way, shape, or form, and that we should be thinking about this as contract pregnancy. I lost that debate. A more recent one has been around the science of mitochondrial replacement transfer, MRT, sometimes mitochondrial replacement therapy. And I think that one of the things that's important here is it makes people think that the work is being done with the mitochondria because the mitochondria is being replaced. But if you think about it, it is in fact the nuclear DNA which is being taken out of the egg and transferred to another egg, which is believed to have healthy mitochondria. I said that should be called human nuclear genome transfer, and I've lost on that debate. I could go on and on. It's a story of losses, so why don't I just skip over the rest of that? I'm just going to end then with one last comment that I think is important because of its complexity. And I think it's germane to the kind of work that Sheila does in terms of drawing attention to questions of authority in science, expertise, who gets to claim, who gets to name, who gets to direct, etc. And all of this ultimately is about power and trying to control, direct a conversation. So the last comment I want to make is about the first and second international summits on human genome editing. The 2015 summit was held in Washington, D.C. I was a member of that organizing committee. When I was asked to be a member, my very first question on the phone was, will this be another Asilomar, which is the Conference on Recombinant DNA? I was told no. I was told that from the beginning, the public would be involved. I was told the fact that a non-scientist like myself was being invited on the planning committee was further evidence of this. It was a 12-member committee. And I think it's important for you to know that there were only 3 women on that committee and only 2 non-scientists. And both of the non-scientists were women. So I want you to just think about the power dynamics in those rooms and in that kind of conversation. The 2018 summit was held in Hong Kong. I did not attend that meeting because I did not have the resources to do so. I would only have been able to attend if I had been a member of the planning committee. I was not a member of the planning committee that time around, and I want to say very clearly that was not an oversight. I wrote, I offered, I volunteered to continue to do some work, and my services were not required. Now, that's in a context where both of the humanists on the committee were replaced, but not all of the scientists. So some of the scientists from the 2015 organizing committee carry over to the 2018 organizing committee. And what I want to end with respect to that is the following. 2015 came out with a position statement about what was going to be thought of as acceptable in the realm of human genome editing, where it would be heritable. The conclusion was it had to be safe and efficacious, which is a kind of science claim. And the second part of that was there had to be broad societal consensus. You've already heard from Sheila, the conclusion from 2018 didn't look at all like that. The conclusion was we need a translational pathway forward. What I want you to appreciate is that the first conclusion was following on science that had been done in non-viable embryos in a lab with no transfer to a human. And we said safety and efficacy, broad societal consensus. 2018, we have children that are born and we're saying we need a translational pathway forward. In other words, this scientist didn't do it well, but we, of course, can be trusted to do it well. We're just going to have to write out the recipe book. And I want to end by saying that one of the things that's really important is another slide that Sheila put up there of an article which labels Jean Curet as a rogue scientist. And her, Sheila's longtime collaborator, former student, Ben Hurlbut, has made the point repeatedly. This scientist was not a rogue. He did exactly what he's expected to do within the realm of contemporary science, which was to push the envelope. How else do you get a Nobel Prize? So I want to end there, turn it back to Sheila, and say, personally, thank you very much for engaging, entertaining presentation.
Thanks. I'd like to thank all three of you for, well, first of all, a very interesting talk and equally interesting and provocative comments. And I'd like to offer Professor Jasanoff just a few minutes to respond to a number of the questions that have been posed and issues raised. And then hopefully we'll get to address at least one additional question.
Well, thank you so much, first of all, Francois and Andrew, for your comments, and I'll try to keep my response brief. I mean, to Francois, it's not hard to keep it brief because I think we are on the same path here, and your account of 2018 and 2015 reminds me that in 2015, I was invited to do policy ethics keynote at the summit, and that invitation came so late that I was already doubly or triply booked on that same day, and I never received an invitation to the 2018 meeting. So, it's not just a question of who is invited, who isn't, what the gender is, and so on, but it's also what is the tranche of scientists as opposed to non-scientists who are being given platforms here, and to some extent it's not equal. I mean, that is, if you are really going to have a conversational movement, then the kinds of eminences of science that organize these things should actually be willing to talk to their corresponding counterparts in these other worlds. And to some extent, that conversation isn't happening. And that's why we're, as you know, Francois, putting together this global observatory on genome editing, together with Ben Hurlbut and a couple of other colleagues, where we hope to have the conversations in a much more egalitarian way. And I think that that is, to some degree, a segue to Andrew. But one other thing I will say, that, Francois, you talked about two different getting things right, and then we would know what to do, right? I mean, so getting the facts right, and then we would know what to do, or getting the terminology right, and then we would know what to do. It's a tenet of STS that you only know what's right because you've already, to some extent, agreed on what to do. I mean, so if you've agreed that it's important to get the virus first before anything to do with the economy, because there's a background decision that until you control the virus, you can't possibly get on with life as usual, then you will come to agreements much sooner about things like masking. But if you've not agreed with that, if you think that the economy comes first and only then the virus, then you will not agree on the scientific efficacy of the masking, and you will have something like the Montana Health Board, where some misguided ideas of representation obviously are at play. And so with that, Andrew, the three things that you mentioned are all very challenging and interesting. But let me point out that though there are many sciences, and these same debates have arisen, as I've already written in 100 different places, around everything that's new or novel in the sciences, there's always this promissory rhetoric. It's always going to solve our problems and give us, energy too cheap to meter, or now the situation where cancer will be just nothing but a galaxy anymore, and so forth. So in that sense, at the frontiers of any of the sciences, you get the same promissory rhetoric, but not all the sciences claim to define what life is. And if there's a single message of the book that animates me and my thinking, it actually came up in the questions from a person who obviously got tired of us and left. I had a chance to look at his string of questions, but it is the question of humanism. I mean, that is, where does a propensity to think about the worth of life come from? Is it purely reducible to the material? And it's not your scientists who will all agree if you ask them the straightforward question, do you think science ought to decree how we should live? I don't know any scientists who will say yes to that. Do they in their practice act as if the discoveries should dictate how we should live? Yes, emphatically yes. I mean, so if science decides that a genetic ailment should be cured, then we should immediately be investing our money in making sure that that genetic ailment is cured, regardless of those other kinds of scientists that you also brought into the picture. And in the book, as well as in much of my other writing, I've talked about the particular narrowing of the imagination at Asilomar, because it wasn't biologists writ large who were there, but molecular biologists in particular who represent this kind of reductionist thinking to a greater degree, because that's where they can intervene. That's where they get the precision from. So yes, there is something different about biology. And what is different about biology is that it is the science that claims to describe and have the last word on what life is, and hence also has segued into declaring what the perfectibility of life should be about. And it is that slippage that I want to call attention to in some sense. And so I don't think it's a matter only of scale. I do think it's a matter of kind, because as CRISPR biologists have gone around saying lately, their science allows us to remake humanity itself, evolution itself. I've never heard that said about nanotechnology. I never even heard that said about the atom, even though everybody recognizes that the power of the atom can allow us to destroy people. It's not to alter. I mean, I suppose that's a drastic altering of the course of evolution, but that's just not the way atomic physicists talk. It's the way that biologists talk. And the price of expertise, yes, sure. But of course, I have never claimed that scientists should not be represented in these multiple fora. What I have talked about is exactly where Francoise was ending her comments. It's a question of what counts as appropriate expertise. So you can easily dismiss your Montana example, because of course medical experts belong in that panel. The question is who else? And if you just say it should be the else's and never the experts, you're making every bit as bad a mistake. But the question of representation, how much, who, for what purpose, to what extent, that is one of the ongoing questions of democracy. And I thoroughly agree with you that my project is every bit as much about getting democracy right as it is anything else. But I think that democracy is a contested term, and I don't think we get it right once and for all. I do think it's an aspirational question. But that doesn't mean that my book is not about science. My book is about the places where science arrogates unto itself to declare what democracy ought to be doing. And there I part company, because I think that all of us as human beings have a say in how we should govern ourselves, and that should be a much more open discussion. So with that, I'll see if other people have questions.
Well, we have very little time left, but on your final note, I wonder, Professor Jasanoff, and perhaps if we have a moment, both Professor Nelson and Bayless could offer us perhaps one practical example of the ways in which broader democratic publics are in fact engaging with forms of governance over emerging science and technologies, and hopefully examples that give you hope.
You'd like those examples from me or from?
Why don't you begin?
Okay. Well, I mean, there's an enormous amount of work to pick up on Francois's term engagement. Engagement has emerged as a term of art in STS, but also in political practice and policy practice. And I think that if one looks back to the turn of the century, there was less of that kind of experimentation with different kinds of fora in which people could engage. But it's not wholly new. I mean, this is a challenge that Andrew threw at me, is this new? I mean, first of all, I don't think just because it's not new, we shouldn't talk about it. Is democracy new? Allegedly, it's several thousand years old, but nevertheless, do we know what it is? I mean, democracy today is not the same as some, Greek worthies going to the Agora and doing their thing. I mean, it's changed a lot. So, there are many kinds of experiments going on, and those are to be applauded. And I think that the term engagement, which has replaced the term that was current when I came into the field. When I came into the field, people talked about participation as if they already knew how to take the parts out of the whole and get them to participate. Today, it's a more ongoing process. And I think Francoise is entirely right when she points to the importance of education, which is what Ellen, your center, is also engaged in. I mean, so how do we get people to engage with these issues and see what is at stake? And so people won't say, this is too ivory tower, and so goodbye.
So one of the things that I have written about is the importance not only of advocacy in terms of recognizing that different people want to come to the table and have things to say, but also using the metaphor of architecture, asking questions about, well, if people have ideas and they want to contribute, why aren't we able to get access to that? Why don't they come forward? And part of what I've said is that a lot of these debates, discussions don't happen in welcoming places. Conversations that happen in boardrooms are for people that wear suits and that know how to navigate a boardroom and that know how to, follow an agenda and participate in certain kinds of rituals that go with that. And so one of the things that I've been trying to get people to think about and talk about is, how is it that we create certain kinds of spaces where we open the door and say, welcome, come on in, we want to hear from you. But we've in fact made it such a space that nobody would ever step over the sill in that context. So that's one of the things that I'm interested in, which is to actually, pay attention to the ways in which we have conversations, which are in fact not welcoming, despite whatever words get uttered. And the other thing is that in that context, one of the voices or communities that I've been in trying to learn from are Indigenous populations around the world. And specifically with respect to my work on genome editing, I am of the belief that we have so much that we could learn from different peoples in different geographical parts of the globe who have some things in common with respect to a different understanding of what it means to be human, of the responsibilities that one has towards non-human animals, that the relationship between animals and the earth. And I think that that's one of the ways in which I can just give you an example of views that don't often get to dominate conversations because they're set aside as sort of not what the majority thinks and or believes. So I'm hoping for openness in two ways: openness in terms of the kinds of fora in which we will try to facilitate conversations and the efforts we will make to broaden the people that are going to feel comfortable participating in those conversations.
I think that's a brilliant note on which to end, and I suspect we're not far apart in that. Our goal here is not for science to live on its own and for it to govern itself, and for it to assume it has its own set of rules which it applies to others. Our goal is to be as participatory and as engaging as possible of multiple different perspectives. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. It's something I have taken from not just this talk, but much of Professor Jasanoff's work, and indeed much of your own, Francois Bayless. So this is tremendously encouraging. And Ellen, your prompt here was, can you give us a concrete example where this is taking place? I will perhaps be a bit self-serving here, but I believe forums exactly like this one and the other talks that the Wayne Morse Center has been sponsoring are exactly the kind of thing that can enable this discussion. So thank you very much to everyone for this opportunity.
That's very, very generous of you to end on that note. Of course, we here at the Morse Center, I and my colleagues are all about both participation and engagement, the older style, the newer style. I heartily agree that these kinds of conversations often can and should take place in uncomfortable situations. And one of my goals with the science policy and the public theme was to engage with working scientists and clinical researchers and others who may not, first of all, have seen the Wayne Morse Center as a resource for them, or have our typical audience of people who are socially engaged understand science as something that was of interest to them. I'd like to thank all three participants today. Again, thank you so very much, Professor Jasanoff, for a wonderfully thought-provoking talk. Wonderful comments from Andrew Nelson and Francois Bayless. Again, there will be more public events coming up in our science policy and the public theme. I hope I will see each and every one of you at one of those future events. Thanks again for attending. Bye.
Thank you.